How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another Pioneer tier list. This week we're going over the top decks in Pioneer. As always, if you don't see a deck on the tier list, be sure to check the description down below. You'll see all of the FMN Tier decks that didn't quite make it onto the tier list down there. Now, before we jump into this week's tier list, be sure to like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton, and it's free. All right, first off, we're jumping off with the D tier. These are the decks that are not quite at the level where I would recommend them for a bigger event. They'll do perfectly well in your local RCQs or any local event. They are a little bit above your FNM tier decks, but they are still not great choices unless you are either able to identify the metagame that they attack or are able to pilot them well above the average. First up, we have Is It Creativity? This is a deck that continues to show up week in and week out, though in lesser and lesser numbers, due to the fact that it has a weak matchup into most control decks, which we saw an uptick in this week, as well as many aggro decks that are able to stop them from getting their combo off. Next up, we have Lotus Field, which continues to show up in small numbers, mainly due to its ability to dominate Blue-Red Phoenix as well as control, although we have seen Rakdos be able to fight through it with cards like Shieldred as well as discard. It does generally do quite well into Rakdos and has a close matchup against Mono Green. This is a deck where skilled pilots will be able to get a lot out of the deck, whereas people picking up the deck for the first time are likely to bomb out of any event they play, so I recommend getting a lot of reps with the deck before taking it to any meaningful events. Next up, we have Mono Blue Spirits, which continues to be a thorn in the side of Mono Green. It's a deck that can continually put pressure on control decks, and although it has some difficulty coming back in the same means that Bant Spirits does when you're looking at its matchup against Rakdos, it does still do a good job against a lot of the decks in the format. But you do have to worry a bit about the increase in red decks that are seeing play, including Gruul Vehicles, as copies of Rending Volley put this deck to bed. Last up in the D tier, we have Red Green Bushwhacker. This is a deck that continued to pop up with some level of success, including several challenge final appearances. However, we are seeing that of the Gruul decks, the Gruul Vehicles deck seems like it is the stronger deck in an open metagame, but don't sleep on Bushwhacker as it does continue to dominate decks that are a little bit slow or a little bit clunky and can really punish decks that lack interaction. Next up, we're jumping right to the top. We have the S tier. These are the decks that are your odds-on favorite to win any given event. They are the most likely to show up in the highest numbers, the most represented decks at the top tables. We've done this enough weeks in a row now where I think we can say it is safe to assume that it is Rakdos midrange and Mono Green Karn. These decks continue to stay a leg above the competition, and while this week neither of those decks had the most number of qualifying finishes, they both put up good numbers, including 6 challenge qualifying finishes for Mono Green. Even though Rakdos had a little bit of a weak showing this past weekend, it still put up more finishes than any deck in the format outside of Mono Green and Blue-Red Arclight Phoenix. Both these decks do a great job of punishing lesser tuned decks, as well as decks that don't specifically have game plans for them. Overall, they are the strongest decks in Pioneer, and though we do have a powerful looking new set in the Brothers War coming, unless major things fall out of that set and shake up Pioneer, it is going to be difficult to see these two decks not dominating the upcoming regional championships. Next up, we move to the A tier, and these are also great choices for any large-scale event. Oftentimes, they have a strong matchup into most of the format, but a certain weakness holds them back. First up, we have Blue-Red Arclight Phoenix, a deck that does quite well into Mono Green Devotion, as well as being able to beat up many of the low-to-the-ground creature decks like Bant Spirits and any aggro decks thanks to your red removal. You are able to grind through most control decks as well, and where you really tend to struggle is dealing with Rakdos midrange, and while that matchup can be a bit of a struggle, it is still winnable, especially if they're not running Leyline of the Void. Next up, we have Mono White Humans. This is a deck that continues to serve as the best aggro deck in the format. It's able to heavily pressure most of the midrange and control decks through its resiliency and has a great matchup into Mono Green thanks to Brave the Elements. Where you're going to struggle is into decks that have a lot of removal when you can't find your cards like Wedding Announcement or Extraction Specialist. And while this deck can fight through most things and is very well tuned, especially for an aggro deck being able to deal with the majority of the metagame, it does still have several tough matchups that if you hit in a row, you will struggle. Next up, we have the B tier, and these are decks that are solid options, and to me, the B tier is about the bottom of where you want to look for competitive events. First up, we have Bant Spirits. This tempo deck is a great example of a deck that can punish the control control decks of the format as well as mono green, and has a consistently strong matchup into any deck that is trying to play to the board with higher mana value cards. However, you do still struggle against the various red removal decks, especially Rakdos, and again, as I said, Extraction Specialist and Collected Company do a good job of making it a playable matchup, but you will still struggle more often than not. Next up, we have Abzan Greasefang, which continues to show up, though in smaller numbers than we'd like to see for this deck to remain in B tier. It does end up in a position where you can combo on turn 3 and really get ahead of most decks in the format, but there is a lot of graveyard hate going around, especially with the rise of Blue-Red Phoenix, so don't be surprised to run into some aggressive hate, especially cards like Leyline of the Void. Last up, we have Gruul Vehicles, a deck that has continued to show up with great success. We saw the Gruul Edel version with Embercleave and Cocos in the side. We saw Red-Green Bushwhacker, and now we have Gruul Vehicles, a deck that leverages the power of a Seeker's Chariot alongside Sky Sovereign console flagship to be able to deal with decks like Rakdos and Mono Green. While you do often struggle into Mono White specifically due to their ability to get below you and grow their creatures out of range of Sky Sovereign, you are still very capable of winning almost any matchup. Last up, we have the C tier. These are the decks that tend to pop onto the tier list, and we're still waiting to see where they fit in the long term, as well as decks that may have good matchups into part of the metagame, but depending on how that metagame shifts, they will struggle moving forward. First up, we have Blue-White Control, which has a stronger weekend than we've seen in the past few weeks, alongside Dimir Control, which also sits in C tier. We saw the return of these control decks, mainly leveraging good permission spells, ways to deal with early creatures through spot removal or wraths. These control decks were able to find a lot of success this past weekend through various builds. We saw some with Narset, Parter Veils, and Days Undoing, alongside with more traditional blue-black control as well. But these decks have seen a lot more success by being able to beat some of these slower decks like Gruul Vehicles. Where the deck tends to struggle is into Rakdos as well as Mono Green, but the blue-black deck is seeming to have a better chance of being able to fight through these draws thanks to its spot removal and ability to fight both in hand and on the stack. Next up, we have Karuga Fires. We've seen Fires Invention decks a lot. We've seen Cavalier Flame decks and things like this in the past, leveraging the cheaper costs of adventure spells that don't go against Karuga's companion ability, as well as being able to play cards like Leyline Binding now that give you 7 drops so you can play with Karuga and draw a card off it later, but it'll only cost you 1 mana. Deck's been incredibly powerful for a few weeks, and we're starting to see it trickle in with several top 8s this past weekend. Next up, we have 5-color Enigmatic. This is a deck that continues to rise in popularity, especially with its good matchup into Rakdos. You're going to really struggle into potentially Mono Green, Mono White, and also the Spirits decks, as you need a lot of time to get your engine online, and even then it isn't a guaranteed win. You still have to grind them out, something that these decks can generally get under or even deal with once you have engine established in the case of Mono Green. Last up, we have Red Black Sacrifice, a deck that continues to float a little under the radar for its power level, but due to its close matchups across the board, except for its favorable matchup against Rakdos, a lot of the times the decks that are above it tend to be pretty well suited into beating it, especially Mono Green. The deck will continue to sit as a reasonably good option for highly skilled pilots, but overall I still think it is the worst of the Rakdos decks, and it's not particularly close in a open metagame. Well, there you have it. That's the tier list for this week. Appreciate all of you for watching. Until next time.